Everyone knows about German tanks, the Tiger, the Panther, the Panzer IV. These machines have been glorified in films, debated in history books, and immortalized in scale models sitting on shelves around the world. But almost no one knows what actually happened to them in winter. Not the battles, not the breakdowns, the thing that happened every single night when the temperature dropped below freezing and the crews made a decision that sounds almost insane when you first hear it. They left the engines running, all night long, not for a few minutes to warm up. Not because they forgot. Deliberately, intentionally, carefully, they kept those massive diesel and gasoline engines idling for hours on end, while the crews slept, froze, or waited for morning. And when you understand why, it changes the way you think about the Eastern Front entirely. Because this wasn't a mechanical quirk, it wasn't poor planning, it was survival. It was the difference between a tank that could fight in the morning and a tank that was a 60-ton frozen metal coffin sitting motionless in the snow while the Red Army closed in. If you want to understand what the Eastern Front really felt like from inside a tank, this is where you start. And if you find yourself learning things you never expected, do yourself a favor and subscribe, because this is the kind of history that rarely makes it into the textbooks. Let's go back to the beginning. The summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa launched in June with 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and an expectation that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. The planning was breathtaking in its confidence and terrifying in its ignorance. German high command had studied Soviet military strength, studied their territory, studied their logistics chains. But there was one thing they had fundamentally failed to account for: the winter. Not just cold, Russian winter. And there is a difference between those two things, so enormous that it broke the back of the most powerful military machine Europe had ever produced. Germany's Wehrmacht had war-gamed the campaign as a summer operation. A fast, brutal blitzkrieg that would punch through Soviet lines, capture Moscow, and end the war before the leaves turned. Tanks would advance hundreds of kilometers a week. Supply lines would keep pace. The Soviet military would disintegrate. None of that happened. The Soviets fought back harder than anyone expected. The roads turned to mud in the fall. And then, in November and December of 1941, the temperature fell off the edge of the world. Outside Moscow, the thermometer dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Not minus 10, not minus 20, minus 40. A temperature so cold that exposed skin freezes in under a minute. A temperature so cold that rifle bolts seized up, that artillery mechanisms locked, that the lubricants in German tank engines, lubricants designed for Central European winters, transformed from oil into something closer to thick paste, something that could not flow, could not lubricate, could not do the one thing it needed to do. And suddenly, the most advanced armored force in the world had a problem that no amount of tactical genius could solve. Their tanks would not start. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand how a tank engine actually works in extreme cold. A tank engine is not like a car engine in any meaningful way. It is a massive, complex machine, generating hundreds of horsepower, running at high temperatures, and requiring a precise balance of fuel, air, and lubrication to function. In moderate temperatures, this balance is relatively easy to maintain. The oil stays fluid. The fuel atomizes properly. Metal components expand at predictable rates. Everything works together because everything is designed to work within a certain temperature range. Take that temperature range and smash it by 50 degrees, and nothing works the way it should. The first problem is oil viscosity. Engine oil in a running engine is a thin, flowing fluid that moves rapidly through galleries and passageways, coating metal surfaces and preventing the kind of metal-on-metal contact that would destroy an engine in seconds. When the temperature plunges to minus 20, minus 30, minus 40 degrees, that oil becomes dramatically thicker. At minus 40, standard German engine oil of the era had the consistency of cold molasses or worse. It did not flow. It sat in the oil pan like a dark, semi-solid mass. The moment you tried to start the engine, the oil pump would struggle to move oil that had essentially gelled. Metal components would grind against each other with no lubrication. The engine might seize entirely, and even if it didn't seize immediately, the damage being done in those first seconds of a cold start without proper oil flow was catastrophic and cumulative. Bearings wore down. Cylinders scored. The engine aged years and minutes. The second problem was fuel. The German Panzer IV used a gasoline engine. The Tiger I, the vehicle that would come to define German tank power, used a massive Maybach HL230 gasoline engine producing 700 horsepower. Gasoline itself does not freeze at temperatures that European theater equipment would typically encounter, but its ability to vaporize and mix properly with air, which is what actually burns in an internal combustion engine, is severely compromised in extreme cold. Cold, dense air combined with fuel that will not atomize properly means poor combustion, hard starting, and engines that even if they did fire would run rough, miss, and produce far less power than they were designed to generate. The third problem was metal expansion, or in this case, metal contraction. Every component in an engine is designed to specific tolerances. Pistons fit inside cylinders with precise clearances. Valves seat against their seats with precise angles. Bearings fit their journals to within thousandths of a millimeter. When everything contracts in extreme cold, those tolerances change. Components that were designed to work together at normal temperatures suddenly fit differently, sometimes too tightly, sometimes with gaps they were never meant to have. The result could be stuck pistons, valves that would not open or close properly, and mechanical failures of a kind that had nothing to do with combat damage and everything to do with physics. Now multiply these problems across an entire armored division with hundreds of tanks. Imagine a morning attack planned for dawn. The infantry is in position, the artillery has pre-registered its targets, the air support has been requested, everything is coordinated, timed, prepared. And then the order comes to start the tanks, and nothing happens. The engines crank and refuse to fire. Or they fire for a moment and then die. Or the oil pressure never builds, and the engine starts knocking immediately, signaling the beginning of catastrophic bearing failure. The entire attack collapses not because of enemy action, not because of a tactical error, not because of a shortage of ammunition or fuel, because the temperature dropped to -30 overnight and nobody anticipated the consequences. This was not a hypothetical scenario. This happened. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, German armored units reported that up to 40% of their vehicle fleet could be non-operational on any given morning, simply due to cold weather starting failures. 40%. That is not a maintenance problem, that is not a supply problem. That is a systemic failure that turned one of history's most powerful armored forces into a collection of expensive, immovable metal objects sitting in the snow, while Soviet infantry worked their way around the flanks. The crews who were there described it in terms that are hard to forget. Standing in the dark at 3 in the morning, wind cutting through whatever inadequate winter clothing they had managed to scrounge, cranking a starter that wasn't turning the engine over fast enough because the battery was cold and had lost most of its charge, listening to an engine that would fire a couple of cylinders, kick, and then die. Doing this over and over again for 30 minutes, an hour, sometimes longer, their breath fogging in the darkness, their fingers going numb inside their gloves, knowing that somewhere out there in the darkness, the Red Army was watching, waiting, probing. And their tank, their only real protection and weapon, was sitting silent and cold and dead. The Soviet tanks had a significant advantage here, and it's one of the less celebrated aspects of Soviet tank design philosophy. The T-34, which would become the iconic Soviet tank of the war, was designed from the beginning with Russian winters in mind. The T-34 used a diesel engine. Diesel engines are, in general, harder to start in cold weather than gasoline engines, because diesel fuel relies on compression heat to ignite, rather than a spark plug. But Soviet engineers had anticipated this and incorporated a compressed air starting system. You could store compressed air and use it to kick the engine over hard enough to get combustion happening even in extreme cold. The T-34 also had wider tracks, better suited to moving in deep snow without bogging down. And Soviet crews, men who had grown up in Russia, who understood cold in a way that German soldiers from the Rhine Valley simply did not, knew how to operate their equipment in these conditions, in ways that came naturally to them. This asymmetry was noticed immediately by German soldiers. It became one of the defining frustrations of the Eastern Front. You could have the best tank in the world, a more powerful gun, thicker armor, better optics, and none of it mattered if you couldn't get the engine started before the T-34s came over the horizon and caught you standing in the snow with a fire pot in your hands, trying to warm up the transmission. The fire pot. This is where things get genuinely strange to modern ears. When you couldn't keep a tank running overnight, and sometimes even when you could, German crews resorted to a method of engine warming that sounds more like something from a medieval smithy than a 20th century mechanized army. They would place blowtorches or small heaters, sometimes improvised from empty cans with fuel-soaked rags, underneath the tank's engine compartment or transmission. They would heat the oil pan directly with flame. The idea was to warm the oil enough to make it fluid, to give the engine a fighting chance of actually starting. The crews called the heaters Vorwarmer, meaning pre-warmers. Some were purpose-built pieces of German engineering, beautifully designed little devices that could pipe hot air into the engine compartment. Others were improvised contraptions that looked like they belonged in a farmhouse more than in an armored division. Using these devices was an art form. You had to get enough heat into the engine without setting the tank on fire. A tank is, at its core, a container full of fuel, ammunition, and hydraulic fluid. All of it flammable. All of it capable of killing everyone inside if you got careless with an open flame near it. Crews learned exactly how long to apply heat, where to position the flame, how to monitor the process in the dark. It became a routine as important as loading the gun or checking the track tension. And it still was not a complete solution. Even with a perfectly executed pre-warming procedure, an engine that had been sitting at -35 for 8 hours was not going to fire up quickly or easily. It was going to start rough. It was going to need careful throttle management. It was going to require the crew to nurse it gently for several minutes before anything like normal operation could be expected. And this is where the overnight running strategy came from. It was not an order that came down from high command in a memorandum. It was not a tactical doctrine developed at a staff college. It was a battlefield adaptation, a survival response invented by the men who were actually living inside these machines and dying when they failed. The logic was brutally simple. A running engine is a warm engine. A warm engine will keep running. A cold engine might not start at all. Therefore, you keep the engine running. Through the night. Idling at the lowest possible speed that still maintains sufficient oil pressure and coolant circulation to keep temperatures from dropping to dangerous levels. Burning fuel, yes. Making noise, yes. Potentially revealing your position, yes. But doing the one thing that absolutely had to happen if you wanted to be able to move in the morning. Keeping the machine alive. The fuel consumption calculations that crews had to make were complicated and constant. A tank idling overnight burns fuel, not as much as it burns at combat speeds, but fuel nonetheless. And fuel in Russia in winter was not abundant. The supply lines that were supposed to keep the Wehrmacht fed and fueled and armed were themselves struggling with the same cold that was afflicting the tanks. Trucks broke down, trains froze, roads became impassable. The logistical tale of an armored division in the Russian winter was a nightmare of frozen vehicles, exhausted drivers, and supply shortfalls that were never quite made up. So the decision to run a tank overnight was never taken lightly. It meant committing fuel that might not be replaced tomorrow, to keep an engine warm that might not need it if the temperature happened to stay above a certain threshold. It meant weighing the certain cost of fuel against the probable cost of a non-starting engine in the morning. It meant doing math in your head, at midnight, in -25-degree darkness, when you had not slept properly in 3 days, and the last thing you wanted to think about was fuel consumption rates. Experienced crews developed a feel for it. They learned the threshold temperatures at which their specific vehicle was likely to give trouble in the morning. They learned how their particular engine behaved after different amounts of cold soak time. They developed opinions about which lubricants worked better and which were nearly useless at extreme temperatures. They traded information, talked to other crews, developed a body of practical knowledge that had absolutely nothing to do with the training they had received back in Germany, because none of that training had prepared them for this. None of it had covered what to do when the war you thought would be over in 8 weeks turned into a winter campaign in temperatures that European soldiers had not experienced in living memory. The German military was aware of the problem and attempted to address it through official channels. Special winter-grade lubricants were developed and distributed. These oils had lower viscosity at extreme temperatures, meaning they would flow better when cold, and provide at least some lubrication during the critical first seconds of a cold start. The development of these lubricants was a genuine engineering achievement, and they made a real difference. But they could not be produced fast enough, distributed widely enough, or made available at the front consistently enough to solve the problem entirely. Units that had access to winter lubricants were better off than units that did not, but even the best cold weather oil could not completely eliminate the starting problems caused by extreme cold. There were also attempts to address the problem at the design level. Later German tanks incorporated improved starting systems, better sealed engine compartments, and provisions for easier installation of preheating equipment. The Panzer IV was upgraded repeatedly throughout the war, and many of those upgrades were not glamorous gun enlargements or armor additions. They were unglamorous but critical improvements to cold weather operability. Better seals here, and improved heater connection there. Small changes that collectively made the difference between a tank that could reliably start at -20 and one that could not. But the fundamental issue never went away completely. German tank engines were designed in Central Europe for Central European temperatures. They were engineering products of a country where -15 was considered a serious winter cold snap, not a routine operating temperature. Adapting them to -40 was always going to be a struggle, and that struggle never ended. The crews on the Eastern Front lived with it for years, through the winter of 1941 to 1942, through the winter of 1942 to 1943, which brought the catastrophe at Stalingrad, through the winter of 1943 to 1944, and through the final desperate winter of 1944 to 1945. Stalingrad deserves its own attention here because it represents the most catastrophic example of what happened when the mechanical problems of winter warfare combined with tactical and strategic disaster. The German Sixth Army and its attached units, including significant armored forces, were encircled by the Soviet Operation Uranus in November 1942. The encirclement placed roughly 300,000 German soldiers inside a shrinking perimeter with no prospect of relief and shrinking supplies. The temperature that winter was brutal, even by Russian standards. -30, -40 were not unusual readings. And inside the pocket, fuel was one of the most precious commodities of all. The decision to run tanks overnight for warmth became agonizing under these conditions. You needed the tanks to be operational to defend the perimeter. You needed to run them to keep them operational. But running them burned fuel, and fuel was arriving by air in quantities entirely inadequate to sustain an army. Every liter burned overnight warming an engine was a liter not available for movement or combat. Commanders at every level were forced to make impossible choices. Keep this tank running and have it ready tomorrow, or shut it down tonight, save the fuel, and hope that in the morning it can be coaxed back to life before the Soviet attack comes. Some units tried to strike a balance, running engines for brief periods every few hours rather than continuously. Others prioritized certain vehicles for overnight running based on their tactical importance, keeping command vehicles and key fighting vehicles running while shutting down support vehicles and trucks. These partial solutions helped somewhat, but could not fully compensate for the fundamental impossibility of the situation. The Sixth Army was being strangled, its tanks were freezing, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The German attempt to relieve Stalingrad, Operation Winter Storm, launched in December 1942 by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, offers a counterpoint that illustrates the same problem from the other direction. The relief force was attempting to break through Soviet lines in bitter cold, maintain an armored offensive across frozen steppe terrain, and reach the encircled Sixth Army. Their tanks needed to be operational every single day, needed to move quickly and fight hard, in temperatures that were working against them at every level. The mechanical casualty rate from cold weather failures was significant even among the relief force, which had access to better supplies than the trapped army. The cold was an equal opportunity destroyer. Beyond the practical mechanical issues, there was a psychological dimension to the overnight running strategy that is worth understanding. A running engine in a tank is not just a mechanical fact, it is a sound. A constant, low, rhythmic sound that permeates the inside of the vehicle. The crews who slept in or near their tanks during winter operations, which was common since the tank itself was warmer than a position in the open, fell asleep to the sound of the engine. For many of them, it became a kind of comfort. Not comfort in any pleasant sense, but the deep, animal comfort of knowing the machine that protected you and enabled you to fight was still alive, still warm, still ready. When the engine stopped, the cold came in immediately. The thermal mass of the tank, that enormous quantity of steel, would absorb heat from the interior rapidly. Within an hour of engine shutdown in extreme cold, the inside of a tank could drop from a barely tolerable -5 or so to temperatures approaching outside ambient. The crew would feel it. They would pull their gear tighter, crowd together, and know that the machine was dying around them. That sensation, that awareness of cold creeping in as the engine cooled, made the sound of the running engine more than just a maintenance decision. It became something almost existential. While the engine ran, we were alive. When it stopped, we were just men in a metal box, and the cold was winning. The noise also had tactical implications that cut both ways. An idling tank engine is not quiet. At close range, it is clearly audible. On a still winter night on the featureless steppe, sound travels remarkably well. Soviet patrols and listening posts could sometimes detect German armored positions by the sound of engines running overnight. This was a genuine operational security problem. Unit commanders wrestling with the overnight running question were not just thinking about fuel. They were thinking about whether the sound of their engines was drawing artillery fire or guiding Soviet infiltrators toward their positions. Against this risk had to be weighed the consequences of silence. Yes, running the engine might reveal your position, but a silent tank on the Eastern Front in winter was also, potentially, a dead tank. A tank that would not start in the morning, a tank that would be sitting motionless when it needed to be moving. Soviet forces were aggressive about exploiting immobile German tanks. A tank that could not start was a target, not a threat. The calculus was grim, but it was usually resolved in favor of the noise and the fuel consumption, because the alternative was worse. There were some creative attempts to address the noise issue. Earthworks could be used to muffle engine sound, digging a tank partially into a depression, or building snow walls around it to absorb some of the noise. These worked to a degree, but constructing them in frozen ground at -30 was itself an enormous physical challenge, requiring tools that might be frozen, hands that were going numb, and men who were already exhausted. Nothing about winter warfare on the Eastern Front was easy, and the solutions were often almost as difficult as the problems. The fuel supply issue deserves deeper examination because it connects directly to the strategic crisis that the overnight running problem created. Germany's war in Russia was always fundamentally a logistical challenge. The distances involved were staggering. From the German border to Moscow is roughly 1,700 kilometers. From the Oder River to Stalingrad is over 2,000 kilometers. Moving fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and replacements over those distances across a country with limited paved roads and a railroad gauge, different from the German standard, was a nightmare from the beginning. In summer it was difficult. In winter it became almost impossible. Every tank that ran overnight to prevent cold starting problems was consuming fuel from a supply chain that was already under severe strain. There is no precise figure for how much fuel was consumed by the Wehrmacht's entire armored fleet simply keeping engines warm over 4 Russian winters. But the aggregate must have been significant. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of nights, even at low idle speeds burning perhaps 20 or 30 liters per hour. The numbers add up quickly. Fuel that might have moved the front forward, might have made a flanking attack possible, might have given a unit one more day of operational mobility, was instead burned away in darkness, keeping oil warm and metal from contracting to dangerous tolerances. This is not a criticism of the crews or even of local commanders. It was the right decision given the tactical reality they faced. A tank that starts in the morning is more valuable than a tank that saved fuel but cannot move. The criticism, if there is one, falls on the strategic planners who launched a summer campaign with winter equipment in a country where winter lasts 6 months, who assumed the war would be over before the snow fell, who sent an army to fight in conditions its equipment was not designed to survive. The overnight running of tank engines is the logical endpoint of that failure. Every liter of fuel burned in darkness to keep an engine warm was a tiny, invisible acknowledgement that the plan had been wrong from the beginning. The Soviet Union understood winter in a way that Germany did not and could not quickly learn. Soviet industrial policy, Soviet military doctrine, Soviet vehicle design, even Soviet training and culture all reflected a fundamental understanding that in Russia, winter was not an exception to normal conditions. Winter was normal conditions. The T-34 was designed with this in mind from the earliest design stages. Soviet logistics were planned around the assumption of winter operations. Soviet soldiers were trained to operate in cold that German soldiers found incapacitating. When the Wehrmacht invaded, it was bringing summer weapons and summer logistics and summer clothing into a country where summer was the exception and winter was the rule. The result was, in retrospect, predictable. But in the summer of 1941, intoxicated by the speed of the initial advance and the apparent weakness of Soviet resistance, it was not predicted. Or rather, it was predicted by some people, and those people were not listened to. There is a particular cruelty in the way that winter arrived in 1941. The first serious cold came in late October, just as the final German push toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, was beginning. The timing could not have been worse. German units that were within striking distance of the Soviet capital, that could see the spires of the Kremlin on the clearest days, suddenly found themselves unable to advance. Not because of Soviet resistance, though that was increasing. Not because of supply failures, though those were real, but because the temperature had dropped and the vehicles had stopped working. The most significant military objective in Europe was within reach, and the tanks would not start. The T-34 was not the only Soviet equipment advantage in winter. The BT-7, the KV series, even the older T-26 and T-28 designs all incorporated features that made them more operable in cold than their German counterparts. Soviet artillery used lubricants tested to lower temperatures. Soviet supply trucks were often Lend-Lease vehicles from America, including the famous Studebaker truck, designed for rough conditions and more reliable in cold than German equivalents. The entire Soviet military machine, imperfect in many ways and paying a horrifying price in casualties for its imperfections, was nonetheless better suited to its environment than the army that had invaded it. And that environmental fit, that basic compatibility between equipment and conditions, was a strategic advantage that all of Germany's tactical excellence and individual courage could not overcome. The specific problem of the Maybach engines that powered the majority of German tanks of the war is worth examining in some technical detail. The HL-230 engine, which powered the Panther and the Tiger I, was a V12 gasoline engine producing 700 horsepower. It was a sophisticated piece of machinery, among the most powerful tank engines of the war. But it had been developed quickly, pushed into production to meet the Wehrmacht's demand for more powerful tanks, and it had reliability problems even in normal conditions. In extreme cold, those problems multiplied. The HL-230's cooling system was another source of cold weather difficulty. The engine ran liquid cooling, using a water glycol mixture that could freeze if it got cold enough or if the concentration of antifreeze was not properly maintained. German mechanics on the Eastern Front quickly learned to check coolant concentrations frequently and to add additional antifreeze when it was available. Running the engine overnight helped maintain coolant temperatures above the danger point. Shutting it down in extreme cold risked the coolant freezing in the engine block, cracking the block, and creating damage that was essentially irreparable in field conditions. A cracked block meant the tank was dead. Not dead for a day, until the engine warmed up. Dead until it could be evacuated to a workshop hundreds of kilometers away, which in the conditions of the Eastern Front frequently meant dead permanently. The gearbox and transmission were also vulnerable to extreme cold. The transmission fluid in a German tank could become so thick in low temperatures that engaging gears became difficult or impossible. Drivers reported that in extreme cold, the transmission would balk, the gears would refuse to engage smoothly, and jerky, rough engagement could damage synchronizers and other components. Running the engine overnight helped to some degree because the heat generated by the idling engine could gradually warm transmission fluid through conduction and radiation. But it was not a complete solution, especially for vehicles where the transmission was physically separated from the engine by a significant distance, as in the Tiger I, which had its engine at the rear and its transmission at the front, connected by a long prop shaft. The track and suspension systems presented their own cold weather challenges. German track design relied on steel components with specific clearances and grease-lubricated joints. In extreme cold, that grease hardened and the joints could seize. Tracks that were properly flexible and functional at normal temperatures could become rigid and prone to cracking or breaking in extreme cold. And unlike the wide, simple tracks of the T-34, German tank tracks were often more complex, with interlocking double and sometimes triple-width track designs that provided good ground pressure distribution but were more vulnerable to ice and snow packing into the track joints and freezing solid. A frozen track was not just a nuisance, it was an emergency. A track that could not flex properly might shed when the tank tried to turn. A shed track was the mechanical equivalent of a broken leg. The tank was immediately immobile. Replacing a track was a job that under normal conditions required a trained crew several hours and the right tools. In extreme cold, it was a nightmare. The track pins might be frozen solid and refuse to drive out. The replacement links might be stiff and difficult to handle. The crew's hands would be numb within minutes of working in the cold. And all of this had to happen quickly, under possible enemy observation, with the constant awareness that an immobile tank was a target. The winter of 1943 to 1944 brought new dimensions to all of these problems. By this point, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The Kursk offensive had failed in July 1943. The Wehrmacht was on the defensive across most of the Eastern Front, and the new German tanks, the Panthers and Tiger Is, were arriving in significant numbers. These were powerful machines, in many ways superior to their Soviet counterparts in gun and armor. But they brought their own cold weather problems that were in some ways worse than those of the older designs. The Panther tank is a particularly interesting case study in the cold weather problem because it was in many ways a machine that was conceptually excellent but practically troublesome. Its Maybach HL230 engine was powerful, but temperamental. Its cooling system was sophisticated, but prone to problems. The Panther's final drive, the mechanism connecting the transmission to the drive sprockets, was chronically weak throughout the tank's production life, and cold weather put additional stress on it. Cold starting sent shock loads through a drivetrain that was already operating at the edge of its design limits. The result was a high rate of final drive failures that immobilized Panthers in the field at an alarming rate. Some units reported that as many as half of their Panthers might be non-operational at any given time due to mechanical breakdown rather than combat damage. This made the overnight running strategy even more critical for Panther crews. A Panther that started properly in the morning and was warmed up gradually was a fighting machine. A Panther that was cold started, that had oil that hadn't circulated, that had transmission fluid that hadn't flowed, that had metal components that hadn't reached proper operating temperatures before the driver tried to engage gears and move, was a Panther that might shed a track, blow a final drive, or overheat within the first hour of movement. The crews learned this, not from a maintenance manual, but from experience. From watching Panthers die in front of them, from being the crew whose tank made it because they did the things that needed to be done, that kept the engine running, that warmed the oil, that nursed the transmission, while the crew of the tank next to them, whose tank sat silent and cold all night, was still cranking a starter motor when the order to advance came. The human cost of the overnight running strategy is rarely discussed in military histories, but is worth considering. The crews who maintained tanks in Russian winter conditions were not just operating machines, they were living in them, sleeping beside them, spending hours of every night managing their mechanical needs. Sleep deprivation was chronic. On a quiet night, someone still had to monitor the idling tank, check oil pressure, listen for changes in the sound of the engine that might indicate developing problems, and be ready to respond if something went wrong. On a quiet night with no enemy activity and no combat operations, tank maintenance and engine monitoring could still consume most of a crew's sleeping time. The physical demands were brutal. Working on a tank in minus 30-degree temperatures with inadequate gloves, with tools that were cold enough to stick to skin, with components that might weigh 50 or 100 kilograms and that had to be handled precisely despite numb fingers, was punishing work. German tank crews on the Eastern Front developed a special kind of hardness that went beyond combat experience. They developed the mechanical intuition and physical endurance of men who spent every day keeping complex machinery alive, in conditions designed to kill it. This expertise was, in many cases, not replaceable. Experienced crews who knew their vehicle, who had learned its particular quirks in cold weather, who knew exactly how long to pre-warm the engine, and exactly when to add throttle during a cold start, were worth more than fresh crews in new tanks. When those experienced crews were lost, whether to enemy action, wounds, or the grinding attrition of 4 years of war, the institutional knowledge they carried went with them. There is a final dimension to this story that connects the tank running problem to the broader strategic context of the war. Germany ultimately lost the Eastern Front, not at a single battle or in a single season, but in a long, grinding process of attrition that favored the side with more men, more industrial capacity, and better suited equipment. The cold weather starting problem was one thread in that larger fabric of disadvantage. Germany could not produce enough winter lubricants, could not ship enough fuel, could not replace experienced crews fast enough, could not redesign its engines for Russian conditions quickly enough. Every winter was a renewed crisis, and every crisis cost men, machines, and operational momentum that could never be fully recovered. The Soviets, meanwhile, were improving. Their tanks got better, their tactics evolved, their logistics improved, aided enormously by American Lend-Lease supplies that provided trucks, locomotives, food, clothing, and raw materials in quantities that transformed Soviet operational capability. The T-34 was replaced by the T-34-85, which combined the original's cold weather reliability with a more powerful gun capable of engaging Tiger tanks at combat ranges. Soviet tank crews became more experienced, more tactically sophisticated, and better equipped. They still fought in conditions that were brutal and costly. But they were fighting on their own ground, in their own winter, with machines designed for it. And German tank crews, sitting in the darkness listening to their idling engines and hoping the fuel held out until morning, were fighting against all of that with machines that simply were not built for this. The story of why German tank crews left their engines running all night is, at its heart, a story about the gap between what a military force is designed to do and what the world actually requires of it. German tank design philosophy in the early 1940s was oriented toward mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility in Central European conditions. It had not seriously grappled with the possibility of multi-year winter warfare in Russia. When that warfare arrived, the consequences were mechanical, logistical, tactical, and ultimately strategic. The running engine was the symptom. The disease was a fundamental mismatch between ambition and preparation. The crews who kept those engines running deserve more recognition than they typically receive. They were not making history in the dramatic sense of charging through enemy lines or holding a position against overwhelming odds. They were doing something quieter, and in its way just as important. They were keeping their machines alive through the night, using practical knowledge, hard-won experience, and physical endurance to maintain fighting capability in conditions that were designed by nature to destroy it. And every morning that a tank started because they had kept it running through the night, and every attack that succeeded because the tanks were mobile and operational, traces back to those hours of darkness, those idling engines, and those men who understood that in Russian winter, the first battle you had to win was the one you fought before dawn, against the cold, before any enemy had fired a shot. It is worth pausing to consider what the alternatives looked like, because understanding the overnight running strategy fully requires understanding why the other options were inadequate. One alternative was simply to accept the starting problems and deal with them in the morning. Pre-warm the engines with blowtorches and fire pots. Take the extra hour to get everything operational, and then proceed with whatever was planned. This was the default for units that had insufficient fuel to idle overnight, and it had real consequences. An hour spent starting tanks in the morning is an hour that cannot be used for anything else. An attack planned for first light cannot happen at first light if the tanks need an hour to start. The element of surprise, one of the most valuable commodities in mobile warfare, is lost. The enemy, who may have been watching the German position all night and knows roughly where you are even if they cannot be certain of your exact strength, has an additional hour to prepare their defenses, to call in artillery, to reposition their own armor. Another alternative was to find shelter for the vehicles, garages or farm buildings, or any enclosed space that could moderate the temperature enough to make starting problems less severe. This was pursued aggressively whenever it was possible. German units in Russia fought over buildings not just for the shelter they offered their men, but for the possibility of parking tanks and trucks inside and keeping them above the critical temperature threshold. A barn at -5 degrees inside, even when it was -30 outside, could mean the difference between a starting tank and a non-starting one. But barns were finite resources on the Russian steppe. There were rarely enough of them to shelter an entire armored unit. Priority went to the most critical vehicles. The command tanks, the heaviest fighting machines, the vehicles that needed to be operational first. The rest were left outside, and their crews were left to manage as best they could. A third alternative was to drain oil and coolant from the engine when it was shut down, store it somewhere warmer, and reinstall it in the morning before starting. This sounds almost absurd, and it was nearly impractical in actual field conditions, but it was done in the most extreme situations. Taking the oil out of an engine when it is still warm and storing it in the tank crew's sleeping quarters overnight so it would be liquid in the morning, then reinstalling it before attempting to start. This procedure was time-consuming, messy, and required spare containers for storing the fluids. It also required a level of mechanical access to the vehicle that was complicated in the dark and cold. But it worked, after a fashion, and in circumstances where fuel was so short that overnight idling was simply not possible, it represented one of the more creative responses to an impossible situation. None of these alternatives was as effective as simply keeping the engine running, and that is why, despite the fuel cost, despite the noise, despite the navigational implications, the running engine was the answer that experienced crews kept returning to. It was the solution that actually solved the problem. Everything else was a workaround that partially addressed one aspect of the cold weather starting difficulty, while leaving others unresolved. The running engine addressed all of them simultaneously. Warm oil, warm coolant, metal components at operational temperature, electrical system maintained by the engine's generator rather than draining the battery in the cold, fuel system pressurized and primed, crew warmth as a secondary benefit. Everything about a running engine was better than everything about a cold static one. The question of battery health in extreme cold is one that often gets overlooked in discussions of German cold weather tank problems, but it was genuinely significant. The electrical systems of World War II-era tanks were rudimentary by modern standards, but still dependent on batteries for starting, communications, and various auxiliary systems. Lead-acid batteries, which were universally used in this period, lose capacity in cold temperatures. The colder the battery, the less current it can deliver, and the less current it can deliver, the less powerful the starter motor spin, and the harder it is to get a cold, viscous oil-filled engine to turn over fast enough to fire. In extreme cold, a battery that had sat all night might deliver only a fraction of its rated capacity. Combining this with an engine that required maximum effort to turn over produced starting attempts that sometimes simply did not have enough energy in them to work. Crank, 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 and nothing. Or a weak, slow rotation that never built up the compression necessary for the fuel-air mixture to ignite. Running the engine overnight also solved this problem because the engine's generator, or dynamo, maintained battery charge. A tank that had been idling all night had a fully charged battery. When you increase throttle in the morning to drive away, that battery was ready to support the electrical demands of the vehicle. One less failure mode, one less thing that could kill you at the moment when you most needed the machine to work. The relationship between German tank crews and their vehicles evolved significantly over the course of the war, precisely because of experiences like these. In the early years of the conflict, there was a certain mechanistic quality to the man-machine relationship. The crew operated the tank. They maintained it according to procedures learned in training. They reported faults through proper channels. As the war on the Eastern Front ground on, and the conditions became more extreme, and the supply of spare parts and technical support became less reliable, that relationship transformed into something different. The crew became the tank's primary maintenance technicians, diagnosticians, and custodians. They knew their vehicle in a way that went beyond any training manual. Each tank had its own personality, as far as its crew was concerned. This engine needs a little more choke when it's cold. This transmission is